Welcome to chapter 5, which talks about the economic development. What does this mean? We'll just jump straight into this. Okay, so economic development sort of talks about the population as a whole, right? You're talking about an individual person in the entire economy. So here we look at living standards, we look at poverty, we look at the population as a whole, and we looked at developed and less developed economies. And in fact, the first subtopic that we're going to be covering is the living standards. And why is living standards important to the government? Because remember, we are still currently talking about macroeconomics, and this is still part of the macroeconomics topic. So why do we care about the living standards, right? As a government, why should I interfere within someone's living standard? Okay, so we'll start off with the definition of what living standards are. And in fact, let me just put the topic right here. This is living standards. Okay, so first of all, living standards. What is living standards? Living standards, or a standard of living, or however way you want to say it, is this. This is the definition, right? So living standards or standards of living refers to all the factors that contribute to a person's well-being and happiness. Okay, and again, that begs the question: why does the government care about this? Why does the government care about a person's well-being and happiness? In fact, that answer will be given to you after you kind of watch this video, and we will learn and kind of answer that question as we go along. But before we go with that, how can I measure living standards? How can they be a unit to measure this? Because economics always deals with analysis. Economics always deals with kind of using statistics and making a conclusion out of it. So I can't just be like, oh, my population is happy, the living standards are good. You can't do that. So therefore, we need to find a way to measure these living standards. And that's where it comes into play. How to measure the living standards? There's a way to measure the living standards, and this is by doing the GDP per head. Remember this from the last topic, GDP per head. What is GDP per head? GDP per head measures the income per person in an economy, right? So that is called GDP per head. That is what we mean by living standards. We don't say, oh, is how happy someone is, or how this someone is, right? That is not living standards. In the economics terms, the living standards is the income, and that's all we care about. What's the average income? So the living standards, or measuring these living standards, measures the average income per person in an economy, and that is in fact what we call, or that is how we actually measure this living standard. Now, why do you think we should have or what's the use of a GDP per capita? Why do we use a GDP per capita to measure living standards? Because how can we relate GDP with living standards, right? How can we kind of relate these two together? And let's kind of answer that. So this part is now how, or the merits of using GDP per capita to kind of measure these living standards. Let's start with the first one. And the first one is GDP is a useful measure of the total production taking place. Right? Remember, we talked about the definition of this in the previous chapter. GDP, which is gross domestic product, is a useful measure, right? It's a useful measure of the total production taking place in the country. Remember, we look at the output. We look at how much output is actually produced in this country. And so it indicates the material well-being of the economy. What does this mean? That means that, let's say my economy is very productive. What does that mean? That could mean a lot of stuff. One, maybe there's a high employment rate, which is making the output kind of increase. Another thing you can say is maybe people have a high enough income to have a high enough demand to have a lot of circulation within, or a lot of money supply within the economy. Remember, we talked about these policies. We said that if there's money supply, we are happy. The government is happy if there's money supply moving around. If there's something that are constantly happening within the market, that is very good. And I can measure this living standard using the GDP. According to how much output is being produced by the economy, I can make a judgment of the living standard. That's what it kind of means. Okay. Now, remember, GDP is calculated on output. So it kind of is a good indicator of how many jobs are being created. Because remember, we had this correlation in the previous chapter that if we have more output, then most likely there's more jobs open, because we connected employment and we connected it with the output. So that's why the government is always happy with output. That's why we talked about economic growth, and that's why it's such an important concept of economics, that economic growth kind of deals with output, but this output is very, very important for the entire economy as a whole. Okay, and last but not least is GDP is already available. Okay, GDP is a metric that's kind of used in a lot of stuff by the government. GDP is used to make predictions for the future, and so GDP is already readily available. So it has the population's data. Why not use it to measure the living standards? Okay, if you have noticed, the way I'm kind of introducing every topic is by first mentioning how we measure it. And it's very important in order to measure something. Because when we went in the previous chapter, what was it? When we talked about the economic growth, when we talked about inflation, deflation, we kind of also discussed how to measure this. When we talked about employment, did you remember that we talked about how to measure employment? We talked about how we can do different types of ways to measure the employment. One, through surveys. Two, by looking at how much, the income tax and stuff like that. So we need to look at how much. We need to look at how to measure this as well, because that's also very important for the government's point of view. Now, there's also a disadvantage of using GDP to measure these living standards, and we kind of have to also talk about that. So now let's have a look at the limitations, right? Those were kind of the benefits of GDP. What about the limitations? So let's look at the limitations now. The first limitation, it takes no account of what people can buy using their income. Just because I have a high output, right? Just because my economy has a high output, that does not mean I have a high income, right? There's no correlation over there. A country with a high GDP, okay, may not also be better with some with low GDP. They could all be the same, right? Because let's say I have a high output, but let's say I have fewer products to choose from. Is that good living standards? No, right? Because when we talk about living standards, I want to kind of define this properly. When we talk about living standards, we're kind of talking not only about my health, not only about my output, not only about my income, not only about my employment, but rather everything that involves in the economy. How much products can I pick from? What is the demand? What is the supply? What is the healthcare? What is my employment rate? What is the inflation in this country? That revolves around living standards. Okay, so similarly, another reason to why GDP is not that good way to measure living standards is because GDP does not consider changes in technology. Because some countries that have a big change in technology can in fact impact the living standard. Because let's say people with might have had more income. They might have had more income but they couldn't benefit from all of the technology available today. Maybe they couldn't benefit with all of it from all the technology that they had. So that's another disadvantage with GDP, right? That's another disadvantage on why we don't use GDP, or in fact why GDP is not a good way to measure the living standard. Another reason to why GDP is kind of a disadvantage is because it excludes the unpaid work people do. Because let's say, right, GDP kind of only measures the output of the entire economy. What about the people who is not working? What about those people, right? It just excludes them, right? Because there are people who do unpaid work, right? There's unpaid work. Not everything, because GDP only deals with output, right? What about the people who are providing a certain service without getting paid? For example, voluntary organizations, right? That is impacting my living standard. That is improving the living standard. But why is it not being included in the GDP? Because the GDP only measures the output of certain businesses. Okay. Now, the most main important point that you kind of need to talk about is that living standard does not only this living standard does not only include what's happening in the economy in terms of what's happening between the trades, what's happening between my working, what's happening between that. But it also monitors leisure activities. It also monitors health. It monitors education levels, environmental quality. Because all of this contribute the people's happiness. And this measure does not do that right now. Okay, so this measure simply just doesn't do that. And I can put that as another reason to why we don't use GDP to measure, or why we shouldn't. I don't know. Okay, we don't need to get into how we do it right now. We just need to look at the advantages and disadvantages and compare the two. Okay, So those are the reasons, or the limitations, in fact, of using GDP per capita to measure the living standards. I'm hoping by now, right? I'm hoping by now we have not kind of directly involved with what living standards are, but I'm hoping from, these kind of advantages and disadvantages, you kind of building a concept to living standards and why the government kind of really cares about this, right? Because you don't have to only look at it in terms of just how much is happening in the economy, what's the employment rate, because employment does not mean happiness for someone. Okay, there could be many other factors, like we said, like leisure activities and so on and so forth, right? The health, so on and so forth. Okay, so not only the activities that are happening in the economy kind of affects this. Okay, now we kind of come to a concept that is currently used in today's economy, and there's something called the HDI, okay, which was kind of developed or kind of used by the United Nations. So let's kind of talk about this, because we use this index to measure the living standard of a certain country. And I find it very interesting because this is how they do it. First and foremost, what does HDI mean? HDI is the Human Development Index. And what does it do? It is used by the United Nations currently to compare living standards across several countries. Okay, now this HDI gives a value, right? It gives a value, and this value is from 0, which is the lowest, and to 1. So it's value between 0 to 1, right? This is what the HDI does. Now, how does this HDI work? This HDI looks at several factors in a certain economy or in a certain country, and it kind of gives a score for each one of them. And let's look at each one of them, right? And the first one it looks at is the income index. And if you've noticed, we've been talking about income in a lot of this part, even though this is not just kind of directly talking about living standards. But income is a very big factor of living standards. Okay, so the first one is income index. Okay, we're kind of measuring that income index, which is measured using the average national income. So what is the average national income of my country, and why is the income related to living standards? Because remember, if I have a higher income, that means I have more money to spend on leisure activities. I have more money to spend on myself, right? So income kind of does have a correlation with living standards. Okay, so a higher average income in a certain economy means there is a higher chance. So they're saying it's called GNI per head, okay, which is the national income per head. When I look at this, when I measure this, then therefore I can see this average income in my country and give a rank to that. The next index that I look at is the education index. Okay, education index, right, which is also a very important aspect of economics and a very important aspect of living standards. Because remember, if I have an education, then that means I have the required skills. And remember, if I have the required skills, that probably means that I have a higher chance of having an employment rate that's kind of high. So the education index is talking about how many years have I spent on education? How many years of schooling have I kind of spent? And that is what the education index measures. So far we have the income index and we have the education index. And the last index is one of the most important ones as well, which is healthcare index. Okay, so we have income, education, and the healthcare. Healthcare is kind of generic. Healthcare is simply the average expectancy that you are kind of expected to live from birth. So that is called the healthcare index. So this United Nations, which uses this HDI, looks at these 3 factors. They look at these 3 factors and then they make a decision. Okay, so far in this topic, what I'm trying to kind of say, we are looking at the different ways to measure living standards. The first way, or the first one, was through GDP. The second one is through the HDI, okay? And the HDI is what we use currently in this economy from the United Nations. And we're looking at the advantages and the disadvantages of each of one of them. Because remember, economics deals with analysis. Economics deals with looking at all the plus sides, looking at all the negative sides. And that's a very important concept to actually kind of learn. Because in your exams, you're also doing the same thing. You're analyzing that question and you're giving the positive side, you're giving the negative side. And if you've watched one of my videos on how I analyze these questions, I kind of look at it in the same way. I look at the positive side, I look at the negative side. So that is HDI, and I'm hoping you kind of understand what HDI is so far, right? It's very simple to kind of understand. It gives a scale from 0 to 1 and it looks at these factors and makes the decision. Now let's look at these benefits. Why HDI is in fact a very good method of measuring living standards. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing that we did with GDP. The first one, which is a very big benefit, is that it takes account into some major indicators of living standards. When you think of life, what's the main thing that you kind of look at? First thing is I should have an income so that I can fulfill my needs, because everyone needs money and money can do a lot of stuff, right? Money can in fact give you a good healthcare, money can give you good education, money can fulfill your wants. So money is a very important factor. The second important factor is an education, because you can only get usually employed the generic way through an education, right? What you are watching this video is very useful because you are part of the education system. And the third most major indicator is the healthcare, because if you have a good health, then that probably means that you have a good living standard or give good living condition, because you can afford to, take care of yourself. So the HDI, which the GDP does not take into consideration, takes into consideration the most major factors. GDP does not take into consideration of the healthcare, does it? Right? So this one does. Next, it recognizes it is not just output, unlike GDP, but also what is the social factors. Okay, so it doesn't just talk about output. Output does not mean that there's good living standards, right? Just because I'm employed does not mean I have a good living standard, right? But rather, I need to have a good health, because a lot of people work there every day, but that does not mean they have a good healthcare. Okay, so social factors is what it kind of looks at, kind of deals with. Another benefit, it is a useful method to compare global living standards. That means that, as you can see, if I go through every country and I look at these certain factors, it's a very equal way of deciding who has a good living standard, because I'm looking at each one of them one at a time. So I can kind of compare this global living standards. Okay, the next one, it's very useful and it's very reliable, because it is produced by the United Nations, which is widely used and recognized, right? So that means it's reliable because it's from a good, right? It's a good foundation, and it's much more useful and reliable compared to a GDP that could be skewed in one way or another way. Okay, so those are the benefits of the HDI. What about the limitations of HDI? Let's kind of look at the limitations now, because with the advantages always comes the disadvantages, with the benefits always comes the limitations. So let's look at the limitations now. If it can paste kindly. Why is it not pasting? Okay, there you go. Okay, let's look at the limitations of HDI to compare the living standards now. Now, first and foremost, it's bad because why? It combines a set of separate indicators into one. Because how can I compare education or literacy rate with healthcare? That's not a must. That's not a must for a good correlation. So several separate indicators all into one could be a problem. Second of all is there are the GNI, which is the income per head, does not say anything about inequalities in the income and wealth within the countries. Okay, because if I calculate the average income per head of the entire country, does that tell me about the inequality? Does that tell me about how many poor people? That could just mean there's one very rich person who is contributing in the average against many poor people, right? But we are not going to be seeing the poor people side, because the rich people's average income kind of makes the entire country look better from just many rich people. And maybe it could be the fact that, let's say, for example, the country India, which has a massive population, let's say there are a lot of rich people as well. Those rich people are so rich that they make the average go so high that the poor people are kind of ignored, because you can't really predict that. Okay? So that could be also bad. Another factor or another reason why it's a limitation is because it doesn't consider other factors such as environmental quality, stuff that stuff like even the GDP doesn't do, right? It doesn't look at the environmental quality. It doesn't look at access to drinking water, the basic stuff. Okay, and last but not least, the HDI information for all countries may not be available. Okay, not every country has information about the healthcare. Not every country has information about the education system. So that could be another factor, because let's say I have the average income, but I don't have two other factors. How can I make a conclusion? Okay, so this is that's basically the HDI, and that's how I can explain the HDI. Okay, now, that being said, we looked at two ways to measure living standards. We looked at the advantage and the disadvantages, and we kind of made a conclusion of kind of what living standards are, right? We kind of looked at everything as a whole topic and kind of made a decision on what exactly is living standards, okay? And we can finally answer that question to you. Living standards kind of deals with everything from a day-to-day person's life. Okay, that means the income, the healthcare, the environmental factors, right? Everything that we kind of talked about in these advantages and disadvantages is what makes up living standards. Now, that begs the question, why do different countries or different economies have different living standards and a different income? Why is that? Why is there a difference in living standards, right? Because if you think about it, the whole world should just have the same living standard because we are humans. Humans all act the same, right? So why is it that it's different? Okay, and therefore now we're going to answer your question over there. So the reasons for the difference in the living standard is now our next subtopic that we're kind of talking about now. And the first one is the difference in living standards within a country. Why is there a difference in living standards within a country? Now, there's several reasons to why this can be, this could be a reason. Okay, why someone might have a high living standard, why someone might have a low living standard. Okay, so let's kind of look at that. The first one is the regional variances in income and consumption. Okay, and what does this mean? Okay, first of all, is that major type of jobs, right? For example, some regions have higher incomes. Okay, some regions have higher incomes, education, health services because of the manufacturing and service heavy regions. For example, if you think about it, the main cities have a lot of opportunities in terms of employment. So that has a higher chance that I have a higher income. And if it's a big city, there's a higher chance I have a higher education. If it's a big city, there's a lot of people working there, higher chance of having a good health service system there. Okay, so this all contributes into the major types of jobs, and this all contributes into the HDI. Okay, the next one is the fact that the different government provinces of those different states. So, for example, that of course each state or each country is subdivided into different parties, and how that is controlled is of course going to be different from one region to the other region, and that's how we kind of measure that, because some local government provinces of education and health can make decisions in different ways. Okay, so those are the reasons to why they're different within a country. Okay, so even within a country it's kind of different because of different regulations, different rules. Some local governments could be better than other local governments, and so on and so forth. And that begs the question, why is there a difference in living standards between countries? Let's kind of answer that now. So we kind of know why it's within the country, but why within different countries? So now let's have a look at the difference in living standards between countries. The first one is the productivity of industries. Okay, so that means that some industries are more productive than the other. Okay, and we always kind of deal with productivity in terms of output, because if I am very productive, that means I am making a lot of output. If I am making a lot of output, we always usually relate this to economic growth. We relate economic growth into a higher employment rate. Higher employment rate is higher income. Higher income is a better living standard. You see how I beautifully connected everything together. So that is one reason to why productivity of industries are one. And in fact, when we start doing questions, which I'm hoping to do in a future time, but when we start doing questions, everything is kind of like a link. It's all linked based, right? And you'll see how beautifully everything in economics is kind of linked. And the way I just linked everything is just beautiful like that, where every concept of economics is linked to one another. And maybe that's how I have been taught, and I'm trying to teach you guys that economics is a chain. It's a chain of series that's kind of linked within each other. Another reason to why the living standard could be different between countries is the fact that many countries have different GDPs, meaning different capitas per income. And that means that someone with a higher income could mean because of how much that certain good is being produced. For example, certain countries where they produce more oil and stuff like that, that means that they are in high demand. And therefore, since they have a higher demand, they have a higher output. And I'm hoping that's kind of I'm hoping you kind of are seeing the correlation here, because what that simply means is that countries that have scarce resources in their economy have a higher chance to have a higher output. And remember, I'm always kind of looking at output with living standards. It's kind of something that I'm hoping you've noticed the pattern, that every time I talk about output, I'm talking about living standards. Okay, so major industries like these countries have some of the higher capita because they have these scarce resources in their country, which are very much in demand internationally. So these certain countries can have a better living standard because of the fact that they have scarce resources within their country. Okay, and that's one other reason to why there's difference in living standards between these countries. Okay, the next reason to why there could be a difference is the ability of citizens to pay taxes, which simply means that sometimes some countries ask for a lot of tax. Okay, usually developed countries, they ask for a lot of tax, and the reason why, if I have a lot of tax, the government can actually use this tax money to start investing in the infrastructure of the economy. In fact, another thing that you need to kind of consider is that many economies are corrupt, right? And it's kind of not discussed in the notes here or in the syllabus, but I'm kind of just trying to explain that this is a big fact, that in some countries, not everyone pays the tax to the government, and therefore the government does not have enough money to spend into the economy. Another way to look at it is some governments, they get the money, but they don't spend that money back into the economy. They spend it on themselves, which is always corrupt. So that's where corruption comes into play, and that is such a big disadvantage for the entire economy. Okay, so that could be another reason for why living standards could be less, because the government is not doing their job properly. Okay, another reason, another difference in the living standards I want to talk about is war, crime, natural disasters. People with natural disasters could impact their health. The ones where there's a lot of war and crime within countries can impact your health, could impact your education, could impact your income. It all comes all hand in hand. Okay, so you kind of need to talk about all of that kind of parts of when it affects the living standards. And I'm hoping you've kind of understood what living standards is, and I'm hoping this introduction of living standards is quite good. So that is it for living standards, right? That's kind of all we talk about, living standards. And now we move on to the topic of poverty, which is not a big topic. It's kind of a small topic, but it's very important that the government kind of deals with what poverty is, because poverty is a very, very big challenge that the government faces and every economy kind of faces, which is poverty. Now, within poverty, we have two types of poverties. We have something called the absolute poverty, and we have something called the relative poverty. Okay, we have absolute poverty and we have relative poverty. I'm kind of going to define both of them. Okay, let's start off with absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is the inability to afford basic necessities. The most basic ones: water, education, healthcare, shelter, food. The most basic necessities, I cannot afford it. Okay, so this is called absolute poverty. What about relative poverty? Relative poverty is a condition of having fewer resources than other people in the same society. That means that you're not absolutely poor. Like you can still buy water, you can still buy stuff, but compared to other people, compared to your entire economy, within the economy, you have a relative poverty. Okay, so relative poverty is basically a measurement of income inequality. That means if I'm in a country of rich people, for example, let's say I'm in Monaco, okay? I live in Monaco, and Monaco is a very rich country. Compared to the people in that economy, they could have relative poverty. And it's very important that we look at poverty in two types of different ways: absolute poverty and relative poverty. So that's kind of the difference between the two, okay? Let's now look at what causes poverty. Why is poverty, what exactly causes this poverty, okay? And let's kind of talk about that right now. So, what causes poverty, okay? Because poverty is always bad, right? No economy wants this, no government wants this. But what causes this? And there's several reasons to why it causes it. And the most basic one is unemployment. When I have unemployment, I have no income. When I have no income, poverty. because I cannot afford basic necessities and so on and so forth. I'm kind of just going to tick that off, right? I'm just going to tick that off. Unemployment equals to poverty. Let's look at the next one. Low education levels. When I have a low education level, I don't have the required skills to get employed, right? So I don't have the necessary skills to get employed because I'm uneducated and unskilled. Then that means it's harder to find jobs. Harder to find jobs means I have no income. No income means I cannot afford the basic necessities. Tick. Let's look at the next one. The next one is size of a family, which is actually a big impact. Because, for example, the more family members I have, the more I have to kind of provide for them. Meaning I'm earning one income, but I have to distribute it for the cost of living for my entire family. So because of that, because I have to split my money for my family members, I could have poverty, right? Because I could not have enough for everyone. I could have enough for me because I'm the only person working, but not for everyone. The next one is the age. Is that older people are likely to have more health problems, and therefore I cannot be willing, or I cannot be right for employment. Let's say I'm not very fit to be employed, which could mean my income is low. So therefore age is another factor. Tick that off. That causes poverty as well. Next, poor government support. This is a very important one. Is because some governments in fact give money to the people who are unemployed just so that they don't kind of suffer and they don't fall into the poverty line, and they try to get them back up on their feet and start working again. So poor government support could be a reason to another reason to why poverty happens. The next one is lack of poor health or poor health. Kind of self-explanatory. Poor health means I can't really work because I'm kind of ill, that is making me able to work. So poor health kind of leads to poverty. Another one is overpopulation, and you might have already known this through general knowledge. Overpopulation, it's very difficult for a government to even handle a population of such a big size, and a high population density means that's a lot of pressure on scarce resources, right? And therefore the economy may not be able to produce for everyone, okay? Or if they do produce, then they produce at very high prices because they only give to the people who are able to produce. So the people who can't afford it, they will just go into more poverty. Okay, so that are some of the reasons to why it causes poverty. And how can I kind of fix poverty? What can the government do to kind of fix poverty? And now let's have a look at that. So the government looks at some policies in order to fix poverty, and that's what we're kind of going to discuss right now. What are some policies that help fix this little topic of poverty, or not even little, but a big topic? And the first one is the introduce measures to reduce unemployment. How can I reduce unemployment? There's several ways you can reduce unemployment. And the first one is using the expansionary fiscal policy. We've talked about this. What does this mean? Remember, expansionary fiscal policy always increases the demand. Increasing the demand will increase employment because I would probably want more output. More output means more employers. More employers means higher, better employment rates. So improves living standards. Next one is to impose progressive tax. We talked about progressive tax when we talked about taxes. Basically, progressive tax is simply when income increases, tax increases. So the people with higher income have to pay more tax, and now this government can use that tax to help the poor people. Next one is to introduce welfare services. In fact, a lot of government does this, is using those tax money that I previously mentioned above, is use the money from the tax and give to the people who are poor just so they can get back on their feet and get back to working and get back to having an employment. Next, you can increase the quantity and quality of education. How can you do this? You can do this using the supply side policy. The supply side policy kind of tackles education as of a whole. That's why you really talk about supply side policies a lot. Okay, and that is the topic of poverty, and pretty much that's kind of it. We talk about poverty, we talk about how poverty is caused and how to fix poverty, and kind of the two types of poverty. It's a very small topic, so it's not, you don't have to go into so much detail into that. Okay, so that is poverty. Let's go to the next topic. We kind of are done with poverty now, and we now talk about the population. We talk about the population, and this might seem like a topic that's kind of not relevant to economics, but it is, in fact, very relevant to economics. So when we talk about population, we're not talking about geography, or maybe we are actually, because it's kind of linked. Population is how many people is living in my economy. And the government really cares about this because stuff can affect this population. There's a lot of factors that affect population. Now, this government wants to keep their population in a stable rate. They want to keep it in a way where I can manage them. Because if my population is too high, then it becomes very hard to implement regulations, very hard to implement rules and stuff like that, which is bad for the economy. So therefore, we look at several ways on the population, and we look at several other factors that when we talk about population, we have to talk about. So let's start off with the factors that affect population. And when I mean factors that affect population, I mean by why is my population so large? Why is my population so small? So on and so forth. We first need to define this term called birth rates. Birth rates is the rates or the average number of children born in a country each year compared to the total population of an economy. So this is what birth rate is. So before I go to the factors that affect population, you need to kind of know this definition because we kind of use this. So factors that affect population, under factors that affect population, we need to learn why do different countries have different birth rates. Okay, why do different countries have different birth rates? Why is some countries, birth rates higher than the other one? Meaning, why do some average number of children born higher than the other countries? And we'll start off with the first one, which is living standards. Talked about this, we know this, is that if I have a more improved quality and availability of food, clean water, medical care, which will result to fewer babies dying, fewer babies passing away. And countries where children often die due to poor living standards have higher birth rates because people have more children fearing that some children might pass away. Okay, it's a harsh reality of life, but that's how it works. Because the the conditions are so bad that they, give out many kids because of the fear that they might lose some. And in fact, a lot of times is a lot of families use kids in a way to help them in their own day-to-day activities. For example, children can be used to help in farms. Children could be used to, you give an education to your child and your child can then support your family. So giving more children could even affect that. So countries with a very bad living standard usually have a higher birth rate. The next factor is contraception, which simply means is that there's an increased use of contraception. If there's an increased use of contraception, which would have fewer birth rates. It's kind of self-explanatory. So those countries that have contraceptions or, have legalization of abortion have a reduced birth rate. They have a reduced birth rate, and this is usually in developed countries where people use contraception and people are kind of it's legalized to abort in several conditions, in several factors. So therefore, there should be lower birth rates. Okay, the next factor that affects birth rates is in fact customs and religion, which is actually a big part, and you might be surprised, but religion does take a part into birth rates. So many religious beliefs don't allow the use of contraceptive pills. A lot of religions don't use that because it's unnatural, and therefore that could lead to large families, could lead to higher birth rates. Okay. Next is the changes in female employment, which simply means that usually if the females are in countries where they're in the labor force, then it's kind of difficult to get babies as well, because managing a baby and working at the same time is kind of difficult. So usually they opt not to have kids at that time. So that affects the motherhood, and because the motherhood affects their careers, so they kind of resist or kind of do not want to get kids at that certain age or at that certain time. So that could also affect the birth rate. Okay, so that's all we talk about when we talk about why the countries have different birth rates. Let's now look at the next metric, which is death rates. Okay, which we kind of look at population in terms of two metrics, which is the birth rate and the death rates. Okay, and then we kind of look at the population structure in terms of male and female, and then we kind of look at why does the population size increase? What are the effects of that? That's kind of what we talk about in this topic. So now let's look at death rates. What is death rates? Death rates are simply the number of people who die each year compared to every 1,000 people of the population. So you need to know this definition. You have to cram this definition. So death rates. So death rates are the number of people who die each year. Why are they different for different economies? Let's now answer that. And it's very, very similar to birth rates, so I'm kind of not going to waste a lot of time in this. But the reasons for differing death rates in different economies, let's look at that. The first one is living standards. Same thing like the other one. If I have a better living standard, that means I have a higher life expectancy. If I have a higher life expectancy, that means fewer death rates, lower death rates. Next one is the medical advances of healthcare. What does this mean? If my certain economy has a better technology for my healthcare, then that means I am more likely to be cured if I have any illness, which leads to less death care. Okay, leads to a less death rate, because I could be cured much more easier because of the technology that's within the economy. The next factor is natural disaster and wars. A lot of countries or certain economies have more like natural disasters, more wars. So there's a higher chance for the death rate to be higher in those certain countries. And that's a factor as well. Okay. So those are some of the factors to why death rates are affected in different countries. A small topic that you need to kind of talk about is why there's something called migration. And you kind of need to talk about it in this topic, migration. And you might have talked about this in geography if you do talk geography. Migration just involves why people shift between different countries. Why do someone try to shift between countries? And there's three basic factors that we look at in economics for migration. And the first one is people move to different countries. Could be because of living standards. If I want a better living standard, I move to a different country. So that's one. They do move because of employment, because if people want better job opportunities, they move into countries that give that opportunity to them. So I would migrate because of that. And second and thirdly is climate. Climate could be a factor that I kind of, is changing for the employment. So that is another factor to why I kind of migrate. So that's just a bit off topic of population, but that's sort of something that you also need to know. Okay, so far what we've talked about in population is the two factors that affect population, which is birth rate and death rate. Okay, and we looked at the reasons to why different economies have different birth rates and death rates. Very important to know this because you would kind of apply this in your questions as well. We now are going to be talking about the population structure. And when I talk about population structure, that simply means everything in terms of age, in terms of what is the age, what is the what's the gender, male to female ratio, because that's very important for an economy to kind of you kind of need to talk about the population structure. And we're going to start off with the first part of population structure, which is the age distribution. Okay, and what do I mean by age distribution? I mean, when we talk about age distribution, I'm just going to paste this and talk about it right now. So it's kind of lagging again. Okay, age distribution. So when I'm talking about age distribution, what am I talking about? When I talk about age distribution, first of all, the age distribution is the number of people per age group. Okay, it's the number of people per the age group. That is what we mean by the age distribution. Okay, now what exactly do we look at in age distribution? In age distribution, it's very important factor, because let's say that we look at the age distribution. That means in a labor force, if I have a very like mid-30s, mid-20s type of people in my economy, then that most likely means I have a good labor force, because at that age, a lot of people are working, right? A lot of people are working, so that kind of benefits the economy. Okay, so people who are, let's say, older, senior citizens, those people are probably not going to be working in my economy because they are close to retirement age. If they are close to retirement age, they're not going to be part of the labor force. So the government has to need to consider all these factors, and that's kind of what we talk about in age distribution. Let's start off with some consequences of an aging population and what's the consequence of populations from aging. Okay, let's talk about this, and we'll quickly talk about this. It's not that big of a topic, but we'll talk about it in just shortly right now. So what's the consequences of an aging population? And when I mean by consequences of an aging population, that simply means what's the disadvantage of having a population that has a lot of old people. So that's what it implies. Okay, so first of all, if I have a lot of old people in my economy, of course, it's not a decision that you can kind of make, but it's a disadvantage for the government. Because if I have very old people in my economy, the workforce will decline, because not a lot of old people can work because they're going to be close to the retirement age. Another reason is the government needs to spend a lot of money on housing, old age welfare schemes. Okay, you need to consider that as well. Next is there's going to be a lot of increase in demand for products for old people. If I have an old population, that's also going to be that, right? Another disadvantage is that old people have less mobile, so maybe the government has to invest in technology for making the mobility of old people better. Okay, so that's what we talk about age distribution. Okay, let's now talk about gender distribution. Gender distribution is very easy to talk about because gender distribution is simply talking about male or female, right? Now, with gender distribution, a lot of factors on why there's gender imbalance. Let's talk about that. The reason why there could be gender imbalance could be the fact that maybe males that go for wars, they get killed, so there could be a imbalance in that way. There could be violence towards females. That could also be a factor to why there could be gender imbalance. There could also be a reason to why maybe having more females will encourage birth rates to rise, and increase the population growth. So these are the consequences of changing gender distribution. Okay, meaning a change in the gender distribution. So let's look at the consequences of this. So if I have more females in the economy, this can encourage birth rates, right? This can have a high birth rate. Now, remember, having a high birth rate does not mean that the economy is doing well. Having a low birth rate does not mean the economy is doing well. What is doing well is when the birth rate is steady and it has a good birth rate according to the economy. That is what we kind of deal with. So there's no certain type of, the birth rate is so high, it's very good for the economy, or it's very low, so on and so forth. Okay, so you kind of need to look at it in terms of that way. Okay, let's now look at the effects of an increasing population size. Okay, because this is a very, very important metric for a government, because a government kind of wants to control their population size. And I kind of introduced this topic by saying that a government must control their population size. So let's look at the effects of these increasing population size. Now, if I have a big population, what does this mean? This means my market size for the home is going to increase, meaning there's going to be more trades, there's going to be more demand, there's going to be more supply. And if you think about this, we looked at a factor of demand as population. Because if I have a bigger population, if I have more number of consumers, I have a higher demand for certain products. Okay, so that's kind of something that you need to look at. The next one is that there could be increased supply of labor, which simply means that if I have more people in my population, that could mean that maybe more people want to work. So that's increased supply of labor. Okay, if I have a higher population size, that could mean there's more capital goods to be produced because you want to satisfy everybody's needs and wants. So that could be also another reason to why having a high population leads to this. Having a high population could fall in the rate of productivity, which simply means that because there are many people working on limited resources, this means that there could be a fall in productivity, right? Because there are too many people and there's scarce resources. That could also be kind of bad. So these are some of the kind of effects of increasing population size, or why it could be a disadvantage or advantage is for another type of, it is for the government to decide based on the different factors. Okay, so that's what we kind of talk about. Okay, and the last part of this chapter talks about what this chapter is about, and that is economic development. So let's start off by defining what economic development is. When we say economic development, what do we mean by this? Economic development refers to the increase in the economic welfare of people through the growth in productive scale and wealth of the economy. A lot of hard words there maybe. But all I'm trying to say is the government wants to improve this developed economies. Means it wants to help living standards improve. It wants to help poverty to be reduced. It wants to have a balanced population size. And you see how everything kind of ties up. So far in this entire chapter, we talked about everything that is revolved around something called developed economies. What refers to something that's developed? What refers to developed countries? If a country is developed, that probably means it has a high life expectancy. It has high literacy rate. It has a low death rate, right? So those are what makes a developed economy. And all the factors that we looked at in this sort of all the factors that we looked in this topic makes up the economic development. Okay, and everything is kind of tied up, and that's how I want to conclude this video, is that a developed economy has different factors that make it developed or not developed. And we talked about living standards. Living standards, if I have a high living standard, that's more likely means I have a higher economic development, right? So those are the reasons of how economic development is affected. Okay, meaning high population growth, meaning if the population is so high, this is very evident in low developed countries. Because remember, we said that countries that can't afford contraceptions, countries that can't afford a lot of like stuff like that, have high birth rates. High birth rates meaning high population and growth would probably mean that that country is less developed. Okay, so all in all, I want to conclude this video by saying that all the concepts that we talked about in this chapter leads to economic development. Living standards leads to economic development. Poverty is part of economic development. Okay, and the population structure, the population age, the population gender all affects the economic development. And that concludes this chapter. And that is how this chapter was kind of made, in a fact that we talk about the different metrics of how we measure economic development and used all those concepts in order to judge whether this economy is good or this economy is bad. So there you go, guys. That is chapter 4. I'm hoping so far this series is going good for you, and we have one more chapter left. So I'll see you in the next chapter. Goodbye, guys.